So we have a very exciting hour ahead of us to talk about the emerging technology, introduction to AI governance, safety, ethics for sustainable procurement professionals. I'm very excited. We've got Edmund and Ben to take us through on this journey. Firstly, I'm just going to run through a couple of things about the Sustainable Procurement Pledge and what the aims are, and then I'll hand over to Edmund and Ben. So one of the key aspects of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge is that we are a group of sustainable procurement professionals who are working together, and so as such we come from companies that can be in competition with each other, and so we do need to be careful around what we discuss, and just be aware of some of the antitrust issues and looking to avoid those. And just a historical aspect, we had Thomas and Bertrand started this pledge 4 or so years ago now, with the aim to get 1 million procurement folks together to sign up to be ambassadors, effectively trying to work procurement as a function to really support on the sustainable future of for people and planet. And so I think we're at about 30 or 40,000 now, and still want to grow. The million target that we have is by, I believe, 2030. So we've got a bit of time, but we still need to scale up more. But that's the overall aim of what we're trying to do. And so the principles of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge is really about people and planet. I talked about that you start with yourself, and what changes you can make from the role that you're doing currently and within the organization you're doing, that we're all trying to work together. No one's solved for this. We all need to share the information we've got and sort of build on each other and create this legacy we're all aiming for. I've talked already about the 1 million procurement professionals to commit to the pledge by 2030. And that we want to have 75% of those 1 million folks making decisions because of their sustainable procurement engagement. So the learnings we've got, these types of sessions that we're running to really upskill us as a function and to be able to make an outsized impact around what we can do for people and planet. So we have both country, topic, and industry chapters, this being a topic chapter around the emerging technologies. And please join up. And you've got a code there, or a lot of our activity is really done through LinkedIn. But we've also got a website, spp.earth, that has a lot of information for people to go to. Okay, so with that introduction, I'd like to hand over to Edmund and Ben to take us forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. We really appreciate the opportunity to present, and we're super excited about SPP, the SPP community, and we think the work that you are doing is incredibly impactful, and we're excited to share some resources for this community, specifically around responsible AI governance. And so let's dive in to the topic. Today, we are going to be covering a specific case study in the area of staffing and contingent labor. So for those out there who do indirect procurement and are familiar with this category, we'll have a really nice deep dive for you. And we'll also be covering what responsible AI governance means for procurement professionals, what it means in the context of strategic sourcing, supplier management, and also how procurement professionals across industries are thinking about governance, as well as ethical frameworks within this emerging category of technology. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen And Matt, can you just confirm that you are able to see this before we dive in?
Yeah. You're all good.
Excellent. Awesome. And so let me just go through the agenda real quick. We have, we're going to do quick introductions, talk about the aha moment, connect it to a what's in it for me case. And this is specifically why AI in non-tech categories for procurement creates opportunities. We're going to talk about the ASCO scopes framework, which is around third-party risk, look at a case study in contingent labor and staffing, and then we're going to do a deep dive into local law 144 of New York as a first pancake for governance within this category. We'll finally end by previewing our upcoming webinars, as well as share some resources for those interested in learning about the topic more. So a lot to cover. Let's dive in. First, introductions. We are presenting this as representatives of a nonprofit called the AI Objectives Institute for a project called the AI Supply Chain Observatory. A little bit of background. AOI is a nonprofit research lab working to ensure that both AI and future economic systems are built and deployed with genuine human objectives at their core, enabled by broad public input and scalable cooperation. My name is Edmund Zagarin. I am a research lead with AOI. And in addition to that, I am the founder and chief strategy officer of an AI startup company in the procurement space called Orchestro. Orchestro is a company that leverages simulations, specifically around quotes, to help large enterprises predict and win faster value across a multitude of categories of spend and supply. And with me is my collaborator on the ASCO project, Ben Room. Ben, could you give a little bit of your background and introduction to our audience?
Sure thing. Thanks, Edmund. So I am the co-founder of Ethical Resolve with Jake Metcalf, who you will meet in a moment. Jake and I have been doing responsible AI and AI ethics and governance consulting for the past 10 years. Most of our work has been with large companies, including Facebook, Meta, Uber, TikTok, Accenture, et cetera. But we also do a lot of work with smaller organizations, investors, and educational organizations as well. So we, in that capacity, help our clients to build AI governance systems, helping them to grow trust and avert risk within their organizations. So I'll pass it over to Jake, and he can tell you a little bit more about his background as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jake Metcalf. I'm, as Ben said, co-founder of Ethical Resolve. I'm also a researcher at the nonprofit social science research organization Data and Society, where I study AI accountability. And I'll be talking to you about my research on the world's first mandatory algorithmic auditing law out of New York City.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. And with that, let's get into it. So our aha moment was really around this idea of AI adoption for enterprises versus suppliers. And I want to share a little bit of data around this because we think that data is super important for understanding how AI is evolving within large organizations. So this is from the Wharton report on Gen AI adoption, which is one of the faster growing new categories of AI. And as you can see, there are significant increases with the use of Gen AI in the workplace. This actually measures how many people in different functions use it once a week. And as you can see, there has been significant increase, not just in purchasing and procurement, management, finance, and accounting, but really across enterprise functions. And we're also seeing that there is some segmentation in who is using this technology, with smaller companies being slightly ahead of mid-sized companies, which are actually significantly ahead of larger enterprises that tend to have more restrictions. we're also seeing that younger individuals are tending to adopt this technology more rapidly and to use it more frequently. And we're also seeing that restrictions on the use of AI technology are extremely common in large enterprises. And in some cases, this is driven by regulatory standards, usage restrictions, data security policies. In some cases, it's employee training and awareness programs. And in a number of cases, it is simply that there is a requirement to have formal requirements from management in order to use AI for a specific use case or task. The largest companies have the highest adoption of these current restrictions and policies. However, in many cases, these restrictions simply forbid the use of AI inside of the company for a range of use cases. And we're going to talk about why that matters in just a moment. Now, what we're also seeing is that smaller enterprises are adopting this much, much faster. So what does this mean? We're seeing that from 23 to 24, in some cases, there is a doubling in terms of the usage. And for companies that are 50 to 250 million, we're seeing a 23% increase from 57 to 80%, and from companies that are 250 million to 2 billion, an increase of 37% from 41% to 78%. That is a dramatic increase for companies that are in this segmentation range. However, for large enterprises, which are over 2 billion, we're seeing that range is topping out at 48%. This means that companies that are slightly smaller than this 2 billion mark are adopting this technology at almost twice the rate. And that is remarkable, and it has significant implications for who is going to be most exposed to some of the most challenging choices regarding providing responsible governance for this technology across a range of use cases. So the key takeaway, AI will be adopted by smaller mid-sized suppliers before large enterprises. In fact, it already has been. And what this means is that therefore procurement teams will be on the front lines of forming governance for AI used by suppliers and third parties on behalf of their stakeholders, which means that for those who have taken the sustainable procurement pledge and want to bring ethical practices into their organization as in the form of governance, this is a critical moment for procurement teams to become educated and empowered resources and trusted advisors to internal stakeholders on the topic of AI governance, because in most cases, if you are a procurement category manager, strategic sourcing leader, supply manager, or chief procurement officer or chief supply chain officer, and you are at a company that is greater than $2 billion, it is extremely likely that your suppliers will adopt this technology before your organization does. With that, we're going to move on to the next section. What's in it for me? A lot of ink has been spilled over the use of governing AI for companies that either make AI models or whose employees have begun using ChatGPT or other large language models. However, in this and our next two webinars, we are focusing on use cases in categories of spend and supply that are not fundamentally or intrinsically related to technology. And the reason is that in many cases, suppliers in non-software, non-tech categories that adopt AI may do so in ways that are not immediately obvious how they are being used. And so for any fellow procurement professionals out there who are motivated by creating value and saving money, I want to help you connect the case for responsible AI governance to something that we can all relate to. providing value to our stakeholders, being a trusted advisor to our internal business partners, and of course, delivering hard cost savings to our finance partners. And so I want to give you just one example of this from staffing and contingent labor, which is call centers. The graph to the right shows a 1-year tracker of total calls per agent. The purple line is agents that are AI enabled. The black line is agents that are not AI enabled. You can see that the cost of operating a call center with AI enabled agents is significantly lower. Why? Because the same number of agents can perform more work in the same amount of time. And the reason that this matters is because AI will create cost savings. It will create cost reduction. And so the question that you can ask to your internal stakeholders and to your finance partners is, will the value created by AI be accruing to your suppliers' profit margins, or will it be passed on to the economics of your business? In other words, will those savings be captured as increased profit for suppliers, or will it provide overall better economics by enterprise procurement teams? And that's really really helpful framing for some of these responsible AI governance questions, which ultimately need to connect back to a key performance indicator that are already well understood by executive leadership. To access the benefits of AI cost reductions and performance improvements delivered by suppliers, procurement teams adopt governance to ensure, 1, values alignment. We want the AI to be aligned with the values of our organization just as much as the individuals carrying out the work are. 2, limiting principles, defining areas where AI should not be used, either as an automated response deflection or even for recommendations. And 3, human in the loop, requiring checks, buffers, and speed bumps that prevent suppliers from using AI to make decisions without a human. And there are two primary tools for governance. One is AI risk audits, that can often be conducted during an RFP or a supplier review. And 2, AI supplier governance policies, plus requests for reciprocal policies created by suppliers. In a subsequent section of our webinar series, we'll discuss the cybersecurity analogy for the evolving regulatory and compliance regime surrounding responsible AI. However, it is useful to think of responsible AI as a brand new area where compliance can create value and where there will be disproportionate rewards given to those who pursue this earlier with greater effectiveness. And we'll talk about that later in this section. So now we're going to go through ASCO scopes, and then we're going to get into the fun case study and talk about algorithmic bias in staffing firms and the New York law. So the ASCO scopes framework, we stole this very unabashedly from the carbon accounting framework, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, and it works almost exactly the same way. So scope 1 is AI risk associated with developing your own model. If you are OpenAI or Google or Microsoft, then you have scope 1 risk. However, most of us from a diverse array of industries are not in the business of developing AI models. And so we may be focused with our AI ethics councils or internal AI governance councils on employee use. And employee use of AI is the scope 2 framework. However, it may also be the case that that scope that could be quite limited due to restrictions that exist on the use of these models internally, or even outright bans that enterprises have imposed upon suppliers. Which brings us to scope 3, use of these models by suppliers or third parties. And it is in fact this area of AI risk that we believe is the most relevant, because smaller organizations may adopt the use of this technology before larger ones. And so with that, we are going to move on to our case study, which is focused on the category of contingent labor and staffing. I'm going to recite this quote because I think it's a useful framework. And then I'm going to pass it over to our resident expert, Jake Metcalf, who is going to talk about the New York law and what triggered it. So Derek Can, Vice President of PM at Monster, says, I think people underestimate the impact algorithms and recommendation engines have on jobs. The way you present yourself is most likely read by thousands of machines and servers first before it even gets to a human eye. And this brings us to the curious case of Jared, the lacrosse player. In an audit of an algorithm created for sorting resumes and profiles of candidates for an internal system developed at Amazon, the algorithm trained to fix on the two most significant attributes: was the candidate named Jared, and did the candidate play lacrosse? Now, obviously, there is bias that's wrapped up within those two attribute fixtures. And it's also, quite frankly, just an undesirable filtering mechanism for a large organization to pursue hiring on the basis of whether or not your name is Jared and whether or not you played lacrosse. This case became somewhat famous because it exposed the way that unregulated and ungoverned AI models can lead to decisions that we are not super happy with and that may run against the values of the organizations that we belong to, leading to suboptimal or even in unintended consequences from decisions. So with that, I'm going to invite our resident expert, Jake Metcalf, up to the stage. And Jake, tell us a little bit about what is New York City Local Law 144 and what are AEDT fairness audits?
Thanks, Edmund. Two more details for that Amazon story that I think are really illustrative and important. Well, first of all, they never deployed it. So Amazon gets credit for doing an internal audit, recognizing the problem, and never using it. And that's important to acknowledge. The second one is not only did it over-index on Jared and lacrosse, it downranked anybody that had the word woman in their CV. So Jared was more important than being the president of the women's STEM club at Harvard, right? So it's not just over-indexing on the wrong thing, it's under-indexing on the right thing. And so that sort of set the landscape a few years ago for governments to start thinking about regulating this space, right? To start thinking about, we can't have a situation where women aren't getting hired for technical positions because there's an algorithm that prefers Jared to the women's STEM club at Harvard, right? And New York City had already been engaged in an internal audit of what their own systems were doing. And on the back of that, the am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Okay. On the back of that, the New York City Commission decided that it was going to make some moves in this space and sort of be a first mover. And so Local Law 144 is a law that they passed to regulate the use of automated employment decision tools, or AEDTs. It's the first law of its kind anywhere in the world. And so, in that sense, it is very important, right? It's a sort of a first trial of some of the principles of responsible AI in a regulatory space. On the other hand, New York City is not that big of a jurisdiction. And so it doesn't, it's not governing the use of AEDTs across the United States. And so it's not the most important law. And it's quite possible that a lot of people, a lot of organizations in any sector don't have to worry about this law. Probably you don't have to worry about this law at all. But it's illustrative of some key questions that you should be asking yourself if you work in the procurement space, especially if you have any responsibility around HR type software. And there's also a lot of lessons in here for policymakers and researchers. I'm going to excuse myself for being a social scientist and making slides with lots of words instead of like nice graphs that more clever business people use. So my slides are a little wordy, but I promise it'll be fun. So really important things here to note is that, right, they're responding to a type of algorithmic harm. That's what we call this, an algorithmic harm. And there's a very well-informed suspicion on their part that there are hiring decisions being made within their jurisdiction that violate civil rights, right? But without being able to open up these systems, nobody really knows for sure what's going on. And so the motivation behind this law was to force organizations that use these systems in hiring to open themselves up to some degree of public scrutiny. And by opening themselves up to a degree of public scrutiny, they would then receive pressure, either internally, externally, maybe from other regulators, in order to improve their practices and therefore demand better from the model developers, right? This is a law that's trying to intervene in the procurement process, essentially, so that if you go out trying to find a tool that will help you with hiring using algorithmic models, you are going to have to ask the developer for proof that you're not going to violate the law. So it's kind of a and on the one hand, it's sort of a weak law. On the other hand, it's kind of a very clever way of using the resources that New York City has. I have 2 academic papers on this topic, one of which won a Best Paper Award at the ACM FACT Conference, which is like the premier AI fairness conference. You can take a quick shot of that QR code if you want to find it. One of these, for one of these papers, we interviewed the auditors who are providing services in these spaces. For the second paper, we went out and we tried to find all of the audit artifacts that we could find. So this law requires employers to post their audits online where the public can find it. We went out looking for those to learn what we could about how this law is actually causing companies to change their behavior. Again, I'll give you a second to take a picture of the QR code if you want. Worst case, you can follow up on email and I'll send it to you. So the main features of Local Law 144 is that annually, every employer that uses an automated employment decision tool must hire an external third-party independent auditor to do a algorithmic fairness audit on the outcomes of those decisions, of their hiring decisions. Second, they must then provide a transparency notice to all job seekers to make sure that if you are applying for one of these jobs, you know that this system is being run on your material. Really importantly is that this law is regulating the end user, right? It's not regulating the developer. New York City just doesn't have jurisdiction over the developers, right? They're mostly in California. And so what they're regulating here is the end user, which would be, of course, part of the procurement question. They're not hiring the vendor, and they're not hiring the deployer. Sorry, they're not regulating the vendor, they're not regulating the deployer. It's actually very unusual in a regulatory space to regulate the end user rather than the organization that builds the tool. The law calls these algorithmic fairness audits, but technically from a HR perspective and from a mathematics perspective, this is what we call a disparate impact audit, right? Disparate impact, I believe, is an idea that has spread throughout most of the world, but is critically important in U.S. employment, civil rights law, and jurisprudence. And it's the idea, right? Like if you, if you are hiring for a job where mostly men apply for it, it wouldn't be a reasonable law to say that you have to hire 50-50 men and women, right? So what disparate impact tries to measure is the difference between rates. So if you have 100 men applying for the job and you hire 50 of those 100 men, and you have 100 and you have 10 women applying for the job, but you only hire 3 of them, that's a difference in rate, right? And so disparate impact is an attempt to capture that is what fairness looks like statistically, right? In particular, there's other types of fairness we can talk about, but this is a kind of quantifiable fairness commitment. In the United States, we've sort of landed on the number 0.8. So basically, if you have 100 men apply and you hire 50, and you have 10 women apply and you hire 4, you're at a 0.8 ratio, and therefore you're within the boundaries of the law. But if you only hire 3 women, then you're under suspicion for having unfair hiring practices, because the rate of hiring the less favored group is below 0.8 of that of the hiring of the more favored group. This isn't a guarantee that you're violating the law, but what it does do is open you up for investigation. If you are above that 0.8 threshold, then you are presumed to probably be within legal bounds. We also call this the 4/5 rule. It's historically arbitrary. They came to the 0.8 number because there was a bureaucratic meeting in the 70s at a California employment agency where they're trying to write a pamphlet on fair hiring practices. And one group said, we think 0.9, and another group said, we think 0.7. And then so they agreed on 0.8. It's not like empirically grounded, but it became sort of part of our jurisprudence, and it's gotten absorbed by the algorithmic fairness field for reasons that I think are unfortunate. Now, of course, this law has to define what counts as an AEDT, right? Like, they're not trying to capture resume screeners that look at years of employment, right? That's not very relevant. I mean, it kind of can be an indicator of age, perhaps, and so you think about age discrimination. But like, it's not discriminatory to have a resume screener that says you need a master's degree and it's kicking out everyone who only has a bachelor's degree, right? Those are relevant to job requirements. And so they're trying to figure out what are the kinds of systems where this risk really resides. And they're most worried about systems where the algorithm makes the hiring decision or makes a predominant part of the hiring decision. They're trying to make space for tools that help you in the process and make the process more efficient, but don't render the decision themselves. And so it's really focused on these sort of deep learning models that use AI to essentially replace human decisions. And so the law says they're in scope if they use machine learning techniques, they output a simplified score or rank based on multiple features, right? So it might rank 100 applicants, or it might say these are the top 5 applicants, or it might give everyone a score. But if it's taking hundreds of inputs and outputting one single score or rank, then it's within scope. And then they're really focused on replace or substantially assist human decision-making in hiring and promotion processes. Now, this is a weird way to write a law because this is a mix of technical and organizational features. And the result is that two different companies might use exactly the same system, and one is in scope and one is out of scope just based on how they make their decisions. And that ends up being very consequential. Lawmakers are motivated by the belief that the transparency would motivate job seekers to seek out employers with fair systems, and thereby employers will seek out more fair systems. And so it relies really heavily on transparency without actually assigning any accountability. There's no specified limit for discriminatory outcomes, and there's no way to challenge those scoping decisions. And so employers ended up with a lot of discretion to decide whether their system was in scope or out of scope. And then if they thought they were in scope, nudge out of scope, but keep using the same system. And that also ends up being very consequential. So we had to do a pre-study and figure out, like, could we actually find any of these audits? So the law only requires employers to post their audits on their own webpage, not in some sort of public repository. So we had to go out and try to figure this out. in a preset, it's just like using Google and looking on Monster and looking on LinkedIn, and just doing keyword searches to try to find how many of these audits were out there after the law kicked in middle of 2023. What we found was nearly half of the results were from parties not regulated by the law. And that's really odd, right? Like, why would you comply with a law that doesn't require you to comply with it? And it turns out because they're trying to, so these were platforms, non-employers, they're platforms trying to find employers as customers. And so they're sort of preemptively auditing themselves in order to demonstrate to their potential customers that they could comply with the law. That's really important in a procurement relationship, right? This is a moment where you can start thinking about what would you ask a vendor of a hiring system how would you ask them to demonstrate that they're fair and that you could stay within the law? So this law is trying to provide a mechanism by which that might happen. And so we found that actually half of the audits available were from people who weren't required to do it, but were seeking some type of market advantage. Once we got down to the nitty-gritty and we did a very systematic search, out of nearly 400 employers, we only found 18 audit reports. That number is shockingly low because we know, I mean, it's impossible to know exactly how many organizations use an AEDT, but that quote from Monster, the Monster CEO that Edmund read, I think is accurate, which is like, if you apply for a job, you're getting scanned. Unless it's like a really low-level manual labor job that you're getting hired by at a small shop, right? Anybody that has computational resources is running this stuff through, running CVs through some kind of screener. It's just inevitable, especially if they're using a hiring platform. And so to only find 18 audits was shocking, much lower than we thought it might be. But there are reasons for it around how this law created loopholes and made a really messy procurement relationship. So in order to explain this, we had to come up with this notion of null compliance, which is if we go out looking for an audit and don't find one, that doesn't mean that the employer isn't compliant. It means we can't know why there is no positive evidence of compliance, right? If we find an audit, we know they're complying. If we don't find an audit, there are 7 different reasons there might not be an audit, and there's no way to know why as an external party. And we really focus on this number 5, which is that the employer deploys AEDTs, has conducted an audit, so they've paid an external party to come in and audit them, and then decided they should not post those results publicly as a risk management strategy. So our suspicion, backed up in our interviews with auditors, were that quite a few employers were seeking to comply with the law, but decided that the results were going to expose them to other kinds of scrutiny, either private lawsuits or scrutiny from federal regulators, right? So this is a law that requires like local transparency, but then to comply with it means you open yourself up to scrutiny from other parties, potentially in a very expensive lawsuit. When we looked at the impact ratios that were present in those publicly available audit artifacts, that's what we found, is almost no one fell below that 0.8 barrier. But we also know that most of these systems would fail that test. We heard from developers, we heard from auditors, we heard from employers that many of these systems fail the test. And so what's happening is that people are making risk management decisions after the fact, right? They've already bought this thing, they've already paid for auditors, they're already using it. They didn't ask these questions in advance, and therefore they're in this tough position of deciding which law you're going to comply with and what kind of risk you're going to expose yourself to, right? Had they asked early in the procurement decision, prove to me that this is fair and that you're not exposing me to legal risk, then there would have been, we wouldn't see this result. We wouldn't see a situation where there's almost no one complying and those who comply are only those who are perfect. We'd see a much higher variation. At least that's what we'd expect as social scientists. So some of the interesting things we found was that, talking to the auditors, they sit at this intersection between the stakeholders who have to interpret the law's demands and hopefully protect job seekers from algorithmic harm. The auditors are going to this business because they care about the harm. They want to protect the job seekers. But the person they have, who they have to satisfy is not a job seeker. They have to satisfy their customer, their client, the employer. And they found the auditors were kind of unhappy with that situation. They found themselves primarily working on negotiating accountability relationships between all these different parties, because in order to do the audit, they needed to get into the back end of the developer's system. They needed to be able to work with the training data, and nothing in the procurement nothing in the procurement process or the contracts with the vendors enabled the employers to do that. This law did not modify those contracts, and therefore the auditors were stuck in the position of like being this middle party between people with conflicting economic interests. The audit itself is mathematically simple. Like, it takes 10 minutes. Once you have the data, it's nothing, and then the report is just a simple table. It's like most of the reports are 2 pages long with one table, because disparate impact is like a simple measurement. So, we're kind of in a situation where like worried about algorithmic bias, and then, you're thinking deep learning systems. You're gonna have to pull them apart and look inside, and you have to be an expert. But really, you're kind of measuring the output of these systems, and mathematically, it's incredibly simple. It's, a 3-part formula. And so the auditors found that they're not there to do the math. They're due to manage the relationships. There's these elements of this law that makes that really hard. Not setting a floor for disparate impact means that this is a law that requires transparency about discrimination, but doesn't prevent discrimination. And that's weird. It allows for discriminatory outcomes as long as you tell the world about it, right? You can be biased, you just got to tell us you're biased. And that's really odd. And so, we really love this quote from one of our auditors, which is that this law is the first pancake, right? You're making pancakes on Saturday morning for your kids. The first pancake out of the pan is no good. Edmund, do we know what's going on here?
Hey, Matt, just checking in. Can you hear us?
Yeah, you're all good.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I think I swiped to a screen with all my gestures. Apologies. Right. Okay. So Saturday morning, making pancakes for your kid. Always the first one off the pan is not the best one, right? The second one is the best one. And this law is the first pancake. There's a lot of lessons to learn from it. And it kind of gives us a sense of the shape of how regulators are thinking about this. I don't expect this to become the law of the land in the United States or Europe. But I know from talking to regulators that they are thinking about it. They're thinking about how this one didn't work quite right, how there's a really low compliance rate, and they're thinking about the structure of it. But essentially, we're going to see something similar around the world, which is going to be an obligation to measure the outcomes and be transparent about it. That's how algorithmic regulation is going to work. It's not going to get in the way of your ability to make your hiring more efficient with algorithms, but it is going to require you to do the test. And so, as procurement professionals who are interested in responsible AI, we're here to help you think through what are the questions to ask, right? How are you going to set up that relationship with potential vendors? Throughout these webinars, and then the SIGU course that we're offering. We're not here to teach you how to be compliant with Local Law 144, because you probably don't have to be. But we are here to help you think through, like, how can you get in front of that trouble, right? How do you ensure that you're asking their questions of yourself and your other stakeholders, that you're not investing in systems that are only going to hire Trevor, right? Hiring Trevor is not good for your organization. I mean, hiring all Trevors, I'm sure there's a good Trevor, but hiring only Trevors is not good for your organization. And we want to help you figure out how to get in front of that.
Thank you, Jake. What a terrific expert perspective. We're super lucky to have a subject matter expert on this topic for this webinar. And just plus one, I know some great Trevors, I know some great Jareds, but I wouldn't want an entire company that's exclusively one type of person. And I don't think most chief people officers and HR leaders would either. So with that, we are going to wrap up on our final section here, which is understanding the ROI of responsible AI transformation. And I think this is super important because if you are a sustainable procurement pledge member and you want to begin a project in your company regarding the formation of a responsible AI governance policy for suppliers, or conduct a risk audit on your spend categories to see where your risk might be, or you want to begin conversations with your staffing suppliers and your contingent labor partners, making the case is critical. And so here with me is Ben Room, who is going to talk a little bit about the ROI of RAI. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks, Edmund. So the way I tend to think about responsible AI and the return on investment that it can help to generate for your company, it's fundamentally just that AI that is built and deployed responsibly works better. I think a lot of times when we think about ethical AI or responsible AI, we think about doing it out of an ethical duty to ensure that its impacts are positive, right? That any harms that it might cause have been identified and mitigated, and any benefits that it generates accrue fairly amongst everyone. And while that ethical injunction matters, there's another kind of like capitalist product motive component of this, which is that AI that is built and deployed thoughtfully actually functions better. And we can see this in a lot of different ways. So first of all, I provide this metric here from some research done by Bain & Company, which shows that companies that build and deploy AI and do so with an effective approach to responsible AI actually generate more profit from those systems. And so what we want to do is look into some more detail about how this actually functions. Fundamentally, what's going on here is that when you consider who is impacted by an AI system and how they are impacted, basically you put yourself in a better position to understand the needs of those people. And if those people are your users or your customers or your own employees who are using an AI system, in effect, what they are going to find is that those systems work better. And so you as a procurement person, when you are thinking through what sorts of third-party systems you want to adopt and deploy within your organization, what you want to be able to do is ask questions of those suppliers that show that they have built their systems thoughtfully and carefully. So one key component of this, there's sort of two components to this, right? There's the carrot and there's the stick. The stick part is, effectively the part that the component of responsible AI that allows you to avoid risks. So one critical thing here, right, is that if you deploy an AI system that generates negative impacts, you are still reputationally and legally liable for those impacts, right? This is exactly everything that we are seeing with the New York law. That if you build and deploy an AI system that generates unfair, disparate impacts, you will still be legally responsible for those systems. And so you as a procurement manager are responsible for ensuring that those systems are working fairly.
And just to be clear, to go back to the ASCO scopes framework, because I think it's important just to double click on this. This also is true if your suppliers are using these systems on your behalf without your knowledge. And so when we talk about scope one, you're an AI developer. My suspicion is that many people viewing this material may not be AI developers. They may not even be adopting AI within their organization and their employee base, but their suppliers may be adopting these systems much sooner. So if you have a staffing supplier or contingent labor supplier, these are some of the questions that you can begin asking.
Great, thanks, Edmund. So this is really the point, is that you as a procurement professional want to know how to ask the right questions. And these are exactly the questions that we will be covering over the course of these next two webinars and in the course we are building for SIGU. And so ultimately what you want to be able to do is explore the fairness impacts of these systems and to determine how they are measured and whether those measures are effective. So if you can do this and you can learn to start to effectively vet third-party systems, you are significantly reducing the risk to your organization. The other component of this, the carrot component, is that basically AI systems that are built responsibly work better, right? So I've done a lot of work in healthcare AI recently. I've done a lot of research. And what I found from the companies that I've spoken to is that the most successful, for instance, triage modeling third-party systems in healthcare are built because they are built really carefully using very carefully curated data sets and a lot of communication with the clinicians who are going to be using these systems. Similarly, explainable systems integrate more effectively into existing organizational processes. So if your system is able to make predictions, recommendations, or decisions that are better understood by the people that are using them, they are going to have a more effective time integrating them into the processes that they are already engaged in. And finally, when we think about the way that systems impact people and AI systems are designed with those people in mind, this ethical design practice will make the whole system work better for everyone who is using it and everyone who it impacts. So I'm going to pass it back to Edmund to close us up here. We've got about 5 minutes left. Please feel free to reach out and get in touch if you have any questions about this. Jake and I can both be reached at ethicalresolve.com. And of course, you can scan this QR code and follow up with this that way as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks so much, Jake. We do have a couple minutes left. So Matt, I'll pass it back to you to see if there's any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share, or any additional information for the SPP viewers. All right. I do see that
I was trying to take everyone off mute. I think I put them on mute. If there's any questions, people can put that into the chat. But I did have one for Jake actually, and if there's time, one for you, Edmund. So Jake,
yeah, for sure.
What with the law that came in, is there like an improvement that's actually happened with some of the recruitment AIs? So I think that's what they're also trying to do, right? Provide that transparency and actually get the AI companies or the developers to make improvements.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, they're trying to intervene in the market and therefore create incentive for improving it at the baseline. It's an unanswerable question. We don't have access to either the previous baseline or the current state.
Right.
The law only requires that the employer's decision-making process be audited, not the back end of the developer across all possible employers. So it's actually not measurable. We could, we plan to do some follow-ups to see if there's more audits that are available now, and see if maybe the impact ratios have changed. One of the results of our studies was that this is a transparency law that actually doesn't make the most important thing transparent, and therefore sort of misses some of its potential. I would love to see a federal law or a federal study or something out of the European Commission that asked a more global question of these systems. And required a transparency at a higher level. But really, you're going to need someone with a little more political pull than the New York City City Council in order to make that happen. Or you need, a researcher with a little more heft than myself to get Monster and LinkedIn and the major platforms to open themselves up to mutual scrutiny. But that's highly unlikely without some more regulatory effort.
But it does then put the responsibility and the liability onto people choosing those solutions, which really, to your point, comes to procurement, right? So if a poor choice is made by procurement, then that opens the organization up for the responsibility and liability.
Yes, correct.
And I think, Matt, to that point, it's also an extraordinary power that procurement teams have, not merely in selecting software platforms, but actually asking their staffing agencies and contingent labor partners what platforms they're using and what disparate impact assessments have been conducted. And so it's also worth noting that AI systems can be biased. They can be biased in ways that are unfair and undesirable. People can also be biased. So there has already been a lot of work for companies that comply in the US with EEOC or globally with other standards around fairness and hiring to gather that information. What we're essentially saying is that when a decision is made by an AI, it's no less accountable to that organization. And ideally, companies want partners who are thinking proactively, not just about the evolving regulatory framework, but also about just ensuring that they're getting the best candidates and providing the best services and resources to their customers, for which procurement, plays a role in both selecting and managing those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for all the attendants for joining. And we'll put the recording up. Then I guess it'll be a couple of days. So if people want to share that, then they can.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for your time.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, SPP. Take care. We'll see you on the next episode.